Okay, I'm pretty sure I've made a recording on this topic before, but I guess I'm going to do so again. It's, I think it's prescient to bring this up, I guess. So I'm watching on Daniel Schmartenberger, I hope I'm saying that name right, a YouTube channel. He's got a video called The Transition, where it's him, Jonathan Hall, Green Hall, I'm not sure, and a third friend of theirs, which apologies for not reciting the name. I'm really bad with names, but okay. Yeah, so this is going to be a kind of a general discussion riffing off of their discussion, and I'm going to, like, in some sense, I'm making very nuanced points, and in some sense I'm not critiquing the substance so much as making a nuanced comment after the substance, but yeah, and I mean, a lot of the things that are spoken about in the transition are very common sense things that, and very categorical outline, conceptual outlines. And I'm just going to make, let's say, I mean, it's almost like the actual particular engagement in the conversation that they keep on saying that we need to have these kinds of conversations. But there are all sorts of conversations that need to be had, which are important sort of meta discussions that even mess with the framing of this, because I would just say that there are some real complex boundaries that have to be respected in order to actually ground a lot of this stuff. And I mean, I really understand a lot of the small elements that are being insinuated and suggested, essentially that the shaman in everyone needs to be cultivated in some sense, and part of this fluid, organic, sort of um, sense making and sort of a kind of a cultivation of how leadership is something that can be part of a communal, sort of culture. Um, that's part of the communion. It's part of a kind of cultural overlay that is part of a vibrant and persistent communion in which there's a fluid, active, living culture. Now, the 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 fundamental problem with these kinds of this kind of thinking is that it's too optimistic. It's not wrong, but it is too optimistic in not taking proper heed or proper consideration of the fact that the structure that you want to inhabit, the structure that you want things to ideally work on, has to be sort of steel manned. It has to. This is an important concept. Whatever sort of culture that you want, it has to have an alternative built into it. It has to allow for people to essentially rebel against it. It has to allow a space for dissent and dissidence in some sense, even if those dissidents only exist as a bad example of what not to follow. In some sense, you can't expect 100% compliance. You have to have a system that is capable of not having 100% of the people buying into it. And the only way to organically do this is to somewhat keep the default system of, let's say, something like capitalism, of something like the win-lose system has to remain in some kind of scaffold. The scaffolding of the win-lose capitalistic kind of system actually has to be the edifice or the container of whatever solution that you want to organize within it. So you can sort of, let's say, you can privately have a solution to these problems, but you can't try to sort of expand that problem as the public default solution. You can't try to deploy the solution as the default that the public is expected to operate within the edifice thereof. The edifice has to be broader as to include the antithesis, and to have the antithesis transparently exposed and exhibited, and to be judged actively by people in the system, not stitched up to be judged in a prejudiced way, but to transparently judge what going against the system breeds in some sense. And that is the only way to conserve with integrity the complexity of the system, that it must be able to shelter its antithesis to some degree, if only to explore it, if only to have it be as part of, let's say, a living memory in some sense. And because there will always be members of our species. I mean, this is the biggest problem, is that the idea that, like, well, if we in one generation can forge the solution and become better people because we can see that we're choosing something that leads nowhere, well, that might be fine for one generation. It's not going to last very long, because those conditions that precipitated the shift are not going to always be in living memory. You know, it's a very yeah. So in some sense, the problem is that a lot of this, what is being discussed in this transition video, is a very disembodied and abstracted form of proselytizing in some sense, and it shouldn't be condemned too harshly for that component of it. But the problem is that overarching narrative is a bit too anti-complex, and in some sense, the general narrative that they are setting up is basically a kind of advertisement to join the Borg. It is the advertisement of that we can become the Borg. This is the narrative that the chorus of the Borg sing. That it's possible that we can sort of be fluidly, jointly part of this hive mind, and that it's going to sort of act with one purpose, and that it's capable of having a single characteristic. It's capable of imbuing a single trait, a single destiny. This is not possible, and it's a fantasy, and in some sense, systems and designs should not be crafted in order to be permanent, secure solutions. They should actually be capable of being broken. They should be capable of being operated to the point at which that they cannot be operated, because they actually depend on a form of good faith, on a form. Obviously, systems need to be designed intelligently enough that good faith is capable of coordinating with other, let's say, good actors, and they're capable of essentially, because I mean, you can set up design in such a system that you actually work out that people who think that they're operating as good actors are actually sort of in a kind of cross purposes, you know, because the metrics that they're monitoring lead them into a kind of inexorable, systematic, you know, sort of virtual conflagration, which they perhaps can't even perceive, because they are just monitoring, you know, sort of some kind of metric that they can't see how the metric is reducible to the consideration of in some sense, you have to treat whatever private system, and I do think it should be a private system of organization that solves these problems by way of design. It should be constructed as a game. It should be with particular rules, with particular roles, and particular ways in which those roles in the game can perhaps be shifted between, and things like that. And in some sense, perhaps some of those roles or some of those aspects in the game should exist so that people can find a way of configuring their interpersonal relationships and their relationships with their collective organization that somewhat reflects honestly or transparently their kind of their self chosen decisions, and is a reflection of their actual agency. I mean, really the biggest problem is people themselves. You know, if you are going to craft a society in which everyone has to be of this particular sort of ideological bent of how they sort of have a worldview or something like that, it's just not going to last. Because it doesn't have the organic resources in order to kind of recapitulate that in a new generation. And no amount of indoctrination will be enough. The idea that essentially, well, if one generation will have it, they'll be able to perfectly replicate it is just, it's psychologically naive. But again, also we have to understand that the level of complexity in, let's say, what is holding us back, even in our current situation. I mean, just the example that's given at the start, that we haven't even solved homelessness. The solving the problem of homelessness is not a question of money. The problem is quite often people themselves. And the idea that you can just you can make up for people's lack of character development by sort of diluting their burdens between a kind of a collective organization is again to misdiagnose the issue latent in the human condition. And without a libertarian, let's say, default position, you're going to essentially create a dystopian nightmare that is going to keep on sort of trying to cover over its own inadequacies by essentially generating designs that more and more take us towards essentially the Borg hive integration, because the collective will have to do more and be serviced more by the individual in order to paper over the, let's say, the lack of integrity on the individual level, and let's say the dampened culture of systematic alignment and rationalization, with making sure that, in some sense, I mean, I think that this is even tacitly admitted to when it is not even considered that we can have an omni-win-win, that it's not even possible to know that you're doing something that's omni-win-win. And that essentially, well, as long as we think that we're going in the direction of omni-win-win, that's close enough. Well, what does that actually mean? If you actually were to cash that out into real terms, you would realize that, well, you have to have a hierarchy of values. There is no way that you can even close to even say that something is even that you can. It's embarrassing to put the description of something being omni-win-win. It's not possible to label something like that unless you have a kind of canonical understanding. It also falls flat in sort of in the general. You have to make it complicated in order to label something omni-win-win. So if it's going to be supposedly omni-win-win in a kind of in a complexity, then essentially that just sounds like false consciousness to me. I mean, you're dealing in things. I mean, you can maybe say, well, it's, what you can say? You can validly say, well, it's not a win-lose. It's not motivated by win-lose. You can say that. I'll give you that. You can say that, this organization is not motivated by win-lose, but you can't say it's motivated by omni-win-win, because you can't define it. It's impossible. So let me think, what is the importance of that? So the discussion of that kind of negative knowledge, and then you realize that, there's a lot of, and then you do need to do something. You do need to have a positive ascription as to what teleos you're trying to imbue in an organizational, sort of drive or something like that, while also recognizing that the organization is not going to have a single identity in that characteristic. It will never, in the same way that ideals are impossible, it's impossible for an organization to have, to just be one characteristic, to just be identified as a single characteristic. I mean, that is just on the way for creating a whole slew of false consciousness. And then essentially, you're condemning people to a kind of half-bred culture of dogma and sort of a kind of a neutered culture under the burden of these kinds of these structural proclamations and claims and promises, and there's definitely room for purity spiraling there, and sort of trying to achieve something that is actually an error in conception in some sense. Because it actually tried to achieve something positive rather than trying to mitigate negative. In some sense, you can only make improvements by managing negative criteria that one has collected and collated and curated as being essentially something that is relevant for the organization on an organizational level to cater to or service or produce. So I mean, these are important distinctions, and then also there are general problems, because if you're going to replace the win-lose, because in some sense no one wants to be a loser, right? So the win-lose game in some sense was not such a bad system to live in some sense, because you could still just because you lived in a win-lose system doesn't mean that you as an agent had to be driven by an impetus of win-lose. See, that's a conflation. So the idea that the default being win-lose in some sense just made the actions and discerning the character of actions within such a system, it just made it more interesting. It just meant that the participants had to be more vigilant, had to be more probing, and it did not preclude the shaman instinct or whatever you want to label it. It did not even necessarily corrode the nice things that we want to have, that we want to think can only be inculcated under a new system or something like that. I don't think that any of these things are necessarily true. And I do think it is to overlook the problem of the human condition to a large extent, and the depth of the problem being inborn in that condition, and the extent to which that we're always going to be posed with that problem in every generation. And in some sense, let's just say that you've got an ideal model of how to sort of get rid of win-lose structures. You found a way to demolish all the win-lose structures, and you've replaced them with other structures which sort of outlaw it, or which make it sort of put very, very hard to surmount obstacles to the win-lose kind of thing. What will you precipitate? I think what in fact would happen is that you would still have conflict, essentially, because essentially there's always a conflict in judgment. So you would need an arbitration. You would need a forum of arbitration for conflict, because conflict would not be gone. In fact, conflict, I think, would proliferate in more obscure ways, in fact, in ways in which that it would almost just be pure psychological, I'm a word, so ignorant I forgot the word, but I'm going to screw up the word, but I'll just try to use it anyway. Anomie. I think that's what Durkheim called anomie. I just watched a YouTube video of someone talking about this, and I've forgotten the word. Anyway, the anomic society. I think that in some sense you would exacerbate the manifestation of an anomic society, of a kind of moral fabric that would just become a kind of a a space of contest for controlling it with a kind of delusional psychosis that the whole society would fundamentally be drunk on, because that would be the only thing to do, would be to engage in that kind of psychotic dominion and demarcation of the space itself, because there would be no transactional elements in terms of the win-lose structures that existed before to disguise the psychological aberrative structures and propensities that exist within the human condition. The only way to try to deal with this would be to have some kind of conflict resolution in which, it was manned by a team of a kind of expert psychologists in a kind of tribunal, that was capable of working out how to solve people's problems. Let me just, this is complete fantasy, and I'm kind of talking off the top of my head, but just follow my sort of science fiction example. So you have this new world that doesn't have win-lose dynamics, and you have a family that decided to continue in the nuclear fashion, and they have very strained internal relations, and the children are subject to parents that are aggressive, frankly, disordered. They have disordered personalities. They have cluster B bullshit. The father is basically psychopath, and the mother is borderline. So the father is narcissistic and the mother is borderline. And it's just constant acrimony. It's just constant shouting, and it's constant performing, and it's very upsetting. And what can you do about this? So you send in this tribunal, and they say, oh, these poor children that are complaining, because the children are even 5 years old, and they realize that this is beyond, this is boundary breaking, psychologically cracking, sort of attrition and psychological warfare, and that these people are deranged. So what will the judgment be placed on this family, that the father should be taken away from the situation and assigned some they must go live somewhere else so that they can sort of self-reflect, and the mother will continue with the children and be helped by the community and be counseled at the same time, and so there's just going to be all the supplementary sort of assistance that's so that this kind of pathology can be diluted and absorbed by the community, and that the community always just has enough extra capacity to take on the burden of these dysfunctional people, that it can make it straight, that it can set it straight, that it can solve the problem. And what happens when you're dealing with psychological issues which are basically malevolent, that they don't want to change, that the psychopath is actually quite comfortable with how they operate in the world. So what are you going to do then? Kick them out of the society? What are you going to do about the children? How are you going to resolve that conflict? At what point do you realize, that you've crossed some libertarian lines? That at what point does the private sphere become immune from public invigilation and inspection? At what point do we say that, no, this is child abuse, this is exposure, that the children are being exposed to traumatic boundary breaking experiences? At what point do you say, no, well, you can't go father more children because you're a psychopath and you're not really repentant and you're not really planning to work on yourself. So we would prefer you not to create these moral hazards that we as a community have to clean up after you, and we don't like the human wreckage that you leave in your wake. How do you deal with any of these things? Now, this, in some sense, is more elegantly solved by the win-lose strategies, there's an explanation to why some people live in dire straits and desperate situations. Because they don't invest in their family units. They don't have strong integral family units. They don't have cohesion. They don't cultivate reason. They have other passions. They have baser desires in which their whole life is centrifugally left in tatters and chaos around the vortex of that selfish internal malevolence. That the idea that you can't just solve everything, that there isn't just, oh well, now we understand the brain, so it's just a lobotomy for you, and then you're a peaceful human being. I mean, we should not forget that was actually seen as a valid medical intervention and a solution to the problem of the psyche to a large extent. So, and I do think in some sense that a lot of these lofty goals and these lofty design spaces that are going to solve these problems for us, I feel like they might just be in the same vein as the lobotomy. They are as overly simplistic in their narrative of the of the good that can be achieved by anything, just by essentially its by its ambitious intention to solve a problem or to tackle something that perhaps cannot be tackled. It requires a different kind of solution. It requires a different kind of hopefulness in the living integrity and trust and experience, that it's a more organic cultural solution in which, and it's only in the right kind of culture that is inculcated that there is a sort of a real solution to it. And the culture is also more than sort of an intentionality or a kind of intellectual resonance. There's a more embodied, less reductive manifestation of that hope. And it is perhaps even slightly more messy, and it's messy, I think, on the level in which, in Star Trek, the Federation was a very messy affair. Federation and Starfleet. I mean, it's very interesting because, Starfleet in some senses was not the military. They were a navy, but they weren't a militant organization. They had weapons because that was a prudent thing to have in an exploratory context. and within the ambit of a very sort of broad purpose, and with teams of leadership or whatever. A culture that is capable of generating projects in the same way that the original corporations were invented things were incorporated in order to do a public work, usually. In the same way, perhaps organic projects could be fielded from a culture, and in some sense it is basically becomes a conglomeration of a loosely associated collection of forms of organization, which are each privately managed as layers of a substrate, and then they each have their own incorporated system, and then they can be novated if the old system wishes to be novated into a new system. They can self-update, therefore, because they're very clear lines of, let's say, organization, or even leadership structures, or in which case it might also be prudent that there are means of arbitration and conflict resolution if there are, let's say, even conspiracies, or if it would be nice if there was an audit done of one of the organizations, that they all fall prone to perhaps a cultural transparency or something like that. And see how far that gets you. See how far you get before the rot seeps in, but don't try to make yourself immune to the rot, because if one does, then you've actually created a veil over which there's going to be a sacred cow of authority, in which you're going to have a kind of a corruption which will be immune to detection, or in some sense I think that there are lots of ways in which you can, because it's going to be a complex system, you're not going to be able to say, well, where is actually the line of integrity, where is it kept? But you could say, well, it would actually be in the arbitration function of this culture, in this private tribunal, in terms of the integrity of its members, in the same way that judges need to be impeccable and they need to have supreme integrity. But in some sense, by not having rulers, by not having judges, by not consensually conforming to a governance, there is no at least concrete institutionalized trust. And that has always been the problem with humans, is can we actually fashion a trust which we can live up to and that we can culturally maintain? Can we re-emerge the concept of the elders that are the guardian class, as it were, but that are transparent, that their actions are transparent to the collective? Yeah, a lot of these things are not good enough just to talk about conceptually, because there are also, in the actual design of many different types of organizations that such a culture might be comprised of. The devil is always in the detail, and but there are some tools that we never had before as humanity, that we have communications technology and such. Anyway, there are message boards, there are ways of keeping certain levels of coordination that never existed before. Anyway. So just to further clarify the point, this is an addendum. There is a made-up word, which is a very good word, noesis. Which is something like the recapitulation of evolution within one generation or within the gestation period of an organism. That when you see the development of of organelles and the structure of the tissues and the phases of development within a fetus, that on some level, I mean, it's not exactly this, but I mean, that's why I guess you make up another word, noesis, that you are seeing a developmental line from a single cell. You're seeing the structure that is a kind of holographic reduction of the evolutionary tract. I don't quite exactly believe that the theory of evolution explains how development actually occurs so much as it merely describes reductively an overarching process that contains the actual mechanism. But that philosophical issue aside, that lineage that life has taken is exhibited in a single generation, in the gestation period. Now, that is what you need for civilization. You need a liberal container. You need a container that contains its antithesis, that is capable of devolving in some small parts at least, or being opted out of, without because the thing that is noetic in civilization is not the collective entity. The collective organization is not a valid or primal or prime identity. The thing that is prime in civilization is the individual conscious container of the mind. The mind needs recourse to its noesis. It needs access to it, because otherwise it will degenerate. Otherwise it won't conserve itself. It won't, and in some sense I think that is the biggest problem conceptually that is happening in the discussion in the transition, is that people are too readily identifying with the group and the necessity that the group needs to be fit in order to accomplish certain things. And it's the wrong level, it's the wrong dimension or dynamic within which to actually frame the actual operating conditions and the structural framework that needs to be in place. In some sense, it's not an organic enough in some sense, those idealistic categorical frameworks are really broad. Sometimes it's nice to have a nice ideal sort of map, even though it's an impossible map, but it's nice to have it because you can kind of use it reductively when you're actually doing the real work, as it were. You can kind of use it as a touch point, as almost like a directionality compass in some very vague sense. But in the end of the day, the detail of the actual design will be so much more sophisticated that those ideal vague approximations will essentially be inculcated into a woven tapestry that will be far more calibrated than than these kinds of reductive, oversimplified, frankly, narratives. That in some sense the narrative is the more pernicious force than the win-lose sort of binary or continuum or spectrum or something like that. Anyway, okay, so I just wanted to add that as a kind of as a way of thinking about it. That the mind needs to somewhat still be encapsulated within a context that allows for, let's say, almost imperfection and opting out of whatever the actual solution to certain problems are, that it needs leeway to indulge. And it needs, in some sense, a transparent mechanism in order to witness that or to observe the consequences of that within each generation. And it so much is that we don't conserve that, we lose a kind of noetic integrity, which means that essentially it's just going to be washed away very, very quickly. Or that experience itself will undermine. It's just its natural continuance will self refute itself because it won't have a foundation to keep it standing. In some sense, it's almost a kind of, in a wishfully thinking sort of way, to believe that what you propose is just so stable in itself that it is a platform and that it's not on a pedestal, and that you don't have to work at structuring or conserving the pedestal that props up that edifice, that is just taken to be a neutral, natural state that people will fundamentally be inclined to as soon as they are exposed to it, or something like that. That it'll just be kind of like a mind virus, or like the Borg or something. Okay, this is an addendum to the histrionic sort of stuff, and yeah, there is a stable, independent piece that needs to be spoken about in terms of narrative, because in some sense I think there are wider points to be made about this, but essentially, I mean, the narrative really is, what I believe the scripture refers to as the God of the world, and it really is also what I would describe as mainly the field of false religion, and it's also sadly where a lot of people go looking for the answers. That's where, and it's the wrong place to be seeking in some sense. And I also wanted to maybe to describe some of my own personal experience, so that can be sort of taken as an anecdote, and maybe I'm incorrectly extrapolating from it. But I'll just say that I think that trying to impoverish one's narrative is a good sort of heuristic in terms of looking for the right answers in the right places. But one should not fool oneself that one doesn't have a narrative. That if one has an impoverished narrative, that's great, and it'll allow for a certain clarity and a limitation on magical thinking. But it also opens the door to a very toxic kind of pathos, which I think I've even expressed in some of my recordings. And in some sense, that's the kind of a kind of existential sorrow at the cleanliness and the lack of elaborate. I think the Russian religious, the old Russian religious, which we don't really understand because it's completely died out from the Russian Revolution. But before the Russian Revolution, when Romanticism was invented by the Russian aristocracy and by the cultural machine, which was essentially the cradle of Western civilization, the heart of Western civilization, Moscow, in their giant aristocracy, in which Romanticism and romantic love could actually be cultivated as a culture, because they had enough, they broke the threshold. They had over 1,000 princes and princesses, so they were actually able to have a kind of a high integrity, high trust culture that could develop philosophically. And one of the precursors that they worked out to essentially being involved in a kind of never-ending self-deluding narrative would be intrigue, which is why that was essentially such a scurrilous accusation, and it was even a noun, that she was being a nosy little intrigue, or a kind of, looking to advance themselves, looking to engross themselves in a kind of indulgent narrative or whatever. Anyway, so, and the lack thereof, in contrast to people who have very interesting narratives, or engrossing narratives, or narratives that seem of high status, or content, or conduct, or involve a large pool of energy, or something like that, or a large karmic quantity, or something like that, chasing after a grand polemic to be part of. That this intrigue at some point has to be dispelled, the mystery of it has to be unraveled. And the more that one chases intrigue, the less unraveling there is to do, and the more one chases intrigue, the greater the looming task of actually doing the work of working out the actual underlying meaning and significance. And essentially that can be completely deferred, especially if the narrative is so engrossing and so complicated and always added to it in its and I think that there is there's almost like a break point where people know that essentially that when they get unraveled into a kind of narrative, that they know that this is a story that doesn't have an end, or this is a story that actually has a certain kind of analytical consequence that can make it insurmountable in a lifetime to be unwound, to be disengaged from. And I think there's a deep meta-conscious, kind of appreciation that also goes on. But anyway, and the lack of engaging in some of these things, I think in some sense this is the kind of the overarching narrative that the soul is engaged in, which in some sense we only have any connection to because of the extroverted intuition of the Holy Ghost, as it were. I am what I am. The forbidden fruit in the midst of the story, in the midst of the garden. The garden being the ordered cultivation of the internal propagation of fruitfulness and in Revelation they talk about the city having 12 kinds of trees that bear their multitude of fruit. Anyway, and I think that in some sense that can be the order that is made in terms of the karmic, the 12 model, the order that is brought to karma from essentially the balance between earth and heaven. Although that balance is achieved individually in terms of the transcending of the false ego complex, or being able to cycle through it fluidly, which is a very kind of peculiar process that can't really be even necessarily generalized between all different metagram types, but mean, yeah, I guess I don't want to be talking about predestination or that kind of philosophical issue, but the phrase "chosen by God," I think, is a should I say chosen by God? I said chosen of God, or I should have said chosen of God. That it doesn't say chosen by God in the scriptures. It says chosen of God. So it is somewhat the overarching meta teleos or purpose or framework that one has calibrated one's character towards pursuing. Are you chosen of God? It is it is a past participle of a decision that has been actively made. So it is a reference to yourself in the past tense, chosen of God. Are you chosen of God? Well, you already are, or you already aren't, which means that it's something that you're not doing, but it's something that you have decided to have known about yourself. Perhaps not known to you, but known to the Holy Ghost. But it is something that you have decided, or it comes from your decision. Because it's something that you are or are not. It's not something that it isn't. It isn't a case of it being the case in the present. Is it true of the reference? Anyway, this is a grammatical sort of semantic jumble to some degree, but anyway, let me just move on. But in some sense, to be chosen of God. I mean, God is a very simple word. It's used in the scriptures in many different ways, and I mean, the God of the world is a title given to the devil in the scriptures. I mean, God just means authority, essentially. The God of something has authority of that something. But to be chosen of God, it does have a certain internal dynamic which only the true God can live up to, because that consciousness is in the image of God. And so, it's almost alchemically formulated in Genesis. And God made man in his own image. And then it almost says the same thing twice. Let me just quickly get the scripture up. Pretty sure it says, and so. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. So you see that there So God created man in his image. In the image of God created he him. So, I mean, they're two different, what are they called? They're not called pronouns. What are the things that's sort of, anyway. So God created man in his image. Own is sort of, is grammatically implied. The King James says in his own image, but it's in italics, which means that essentially it's not, means that essentially it's grammatically implied when you translate it into English that its own image. So God created man in his image. In the image of God created he him. So in the one tense it says his, in the other tenses, I shouldn't say that. So God created man in his image. In the image of God created he him. So there's he, him, and there's in his image. Man in his image. God created he, him. He is in the present tense. Him is the reference to he. So when we talk about him, we're talking about a third person, or we're talking about ourselves in the third person. We're objectifying the self. When we're talking about he, we are referring to character. Essentially, we're making a kind of ad hominem. Prescription or evaluation. I don't know if I want to get into this, but I guess I'll just do it anyway. So God created man in his image. So you see that in some sense, God creating man in his own image, it has to be done in a dynamic way. It has to be done in a way in which it's done twice. That God has to create the understanding of himself in the mind of Adam, let's just say, as an example. I mean, yeah, you see, it has to. There's a secular reduction to this, essentially, which is that Adam invented the concept of God. But Adam inventing the concept of God, Adam understanding the concept of God, has to be teleologically framed. Is that God creates the concept of he, which performs an ability to have recourse to a reference of him, so that he leaves a record of him. What he does was done by him. And that is only even made possible because there is a true authority over the mind. It's a very simple understanding that essentially the to be chosen of God is a very simple operative principle that underpins coherence in the understanding, that you don't even have recourse to a stable reality. You don't have reference to a stable reality. If there isn't an authority that can bind the reference of him to he, that there must be an overarching truth that contains these images, so that they actually have a soul which is being maintained and conserved by the Spirit of God. The actual process of that conservation, though, is a forbidden that to us in our incarnated form we would only appreciate as the knowledge of good and evil. And so the aspect of God that relates to that, which I have formulated as being in the that I am what I am. Well, what are you? Do you know what you are? Because I am what I am. So if I am what I am, then what is it that I am referring to when I say I am what I am? I can't know. The only way I could know that is if I had the knowledge of good and evil. If I had that, then I can't be alive. And having that is what makes me dead, what atrophies the spirit into an image, in which the image becomes an idolatry, because it's not underpinned by essentially being conserved by the Holy Ghost. The Holy Ghost has been translated into an idolatry, which is not even an imprint of the divine in some sense. It's an imprint of a kind of expectation or predictability, or a kind of it's a self-image, which in some sense can only be grounded by an environmental sort of camouflage. And then you have the sort of the archetype of the snake, which is camouflaged with its environment. Okay, anyway, I guess enough of this sort of rambling. So, it is simple, but it's also a bit mysterious and peculiar and complicated, that it does require a stone to philosophy to some extent, so that we are not bandied about by the winds of doctrine and misled and led towards those who satisfy them with itching ears and such and such. But until the full stature of the Christ is achieved, and the perfection of the faith, which is what is described in Ephesians, so that people might one day say what is said in Corinthians, which, I mean, in some sense I think that the so-called Christian culture is a complete, largely it does not represent anything of what is represented in the scripture in terms of the kind of belief and the kind of faith and the kind of understanding that it says in Corinthians that we have the mind of Christ. And you'll never find Christians today saying things like that. It's a different creed. It's a different false religion that has come to take its place. It's just more narrative sort of concoction. It's more God of the world shell narratives and things like that. But okay, well, yeah, so let me finish what I'm saying about the narrative. So, alchemy, the great work to find the stone of philosophy. I mean, a lot of attempts to get the Philosopher's Stone has been really bad, because essentially they're looking in the wrong place. They try to obtain it via the narrative, and they don't try to understand the form, every component of the narrative. They don't take a sort of a broad enough approach into decoding the matrix, as it were. And some of them even get very close, and they often achieve quite a lot of power, but it's sort of, the whole search was sort of leavened, was corrupted and tainted by whatever trappings of the narrative that they were already sort of held and contended within the auspices thereof. And this is why it's problematic, because you have to have a broad enough you have to have a low enough narrative to begin with, which is why I think that a kind of the borderline abuse to some people. I mean, I think this is what Crowley was obsessed with as well, in terms of trying to precipitate a whore of Babylon, which would, some people, I guess, that would precipitate the Antichrist or something like that, or there's a lot of sort of strange esoteric weirdness and things like that. Crowley, I think, thought of himself as the Antichrist, which is strange, because, I mean, in some sense, pretty much everyone is an Antichrist, according to the definition of First John chapter 4. If they believe in a narrative that the solution is coming by the resolution of the narrative, then effectively you're an Antichrist. If you believe that it should come when even now already is it in the world, that is the spirit of Antichrist. And to the point at which that Antichrist sentiment is woven into and is the prerequisite of the narrative itself, all these endeavors are fundamentally corrupt. But which is something like the idea that things can't be soluble. It's something like the resignation that things are left. That things must be left sort of into the care and the camouflage of the worldly, that you can't take responsibility for it. That the narrative must run its course, or something like that. That there is something that the mind obliquely recedes from. Recedes from a circumvention of the notion of responsibility. And in some sense, the way that you take responsibility for things that you can't change is that you absorb the epistemic responsibility of the situation. You hold yourself accountable, and that does not mean to engage in reactive complaining and sympathy mongering and joining the narrative then in a strange kind of propitiatory exacerbation. There's a fine line here. Blessed are the peacemakers. The peacemakers are not the conflict avoiders. And shying away from essentially the light that God has created, which is the light of the mind, the light of understanding, the light that came before the creation of the sun and the stars. That this light is is the reason which is God manifest in the world. And those who their hearts are dead because they have no understanding. Emotionality is when the ancient when people that lived 2,000 years ago, who didn't believe in neuroscience, who didn't have neuroscience, pointed at their chest and they said, "This is my heart." That was the center of their motivation. That was the center of their impetus, of their will. That was also the center of their faith and their intellect. Faith is an intellectual exercise. The better equivalent of today would be to point at one's temple, at one's head, and talk about the heart of understanding. To have recourse to the heart that is spoken about in the New Testament. Because a lot of this narrative that has repurposed this word heart, it's a decrepit, fleshly, it's a whole lot of expectation, it's a whole lot of confusion of chaotic sensations. It's fleshly thinking. It's cosmic entitlement and fatalism. It's praying to a god of the clouds, a sky father. It might as well be pagans talking about Zeus. God is just a holder of the narrative for them. It doesn't exist within. They have no place within because their religion is without understanding and without an appreciation of understanding. It's just a context for their feelings. And in as much as they want stable feelings, they want a stable context, they want a stable narrative. And it's just dogma. There's nothing spiritual or religious about it. There's no interior space. That could house a god. In some sense, it's just a kind of a system of idolatry. And the rational alignment that they have to that idolatry proves that they are gives them a kind of token of righteousness. They don't understand the true crown of glory, as it were. Which is awarded in heaven only. Which is a private how to phrase this? The interface with heaven is a very private affair. You can discern heavenly states from the outside, but the involvement that one has with heaven, it's not a collective. want to neaten that up slightly by talking about communion and how gifts are given and not received by the world, but they are give and it will be given. And in some sense, it is a kind of, that relationship to God is a kind of, you can metaphorically or allegorically sort of call it a semi-form of solipsism, in which essentially under a kind of monotheistic, this very sophisticated sort of form of monotheism that is rooted deeply, which is a private conviction, which is only ever a private conviction, does allow for a certain actualization and integration with spiritual gifts with other people, and does allow for discerning and things like that, and does allow for people to help quicken each other and to be part of a culture that is definitely spiritually infused. But it has no objective exterior existence. It's a there's only one ticket in some sense, and that one ticket is the only begotten Son. There's only one only begotten Son, you see, and it's in that way that the brethren and the brotherhood and the brothers in the faith, that culture is constructed out of one type of component, which is privately convicted in its authenticity, that the kingdom is never seen as an external observation. It's a private endeavor in that sense. Yeah, I mean, I guess, there are elements in this, this is why Malkuth is the earth, which is also the burgeoning kingdom. What is it? Malkuth, I think, is the gift of the evangelist of defining the exuberance that in the structures of that private conviction that infuse the private connection to heaven into the external perception, and with sensation. Anyway, I'm a theoretician talking about all these abstract things all the time. There's another issue, which is a slight reiteration of a point that I've already made, which I think is also important, which is in the template of the win-lose game. That really does allow issues of trust to become manifest, because it gives people a medium within which that they can sacrifice so as to kind of express or exhibit trust. It doesn't, it's within the template of a win-lose game. Let's say the issue of trust comes to a peak. It becomes poignant. It becomes also, it has a medium in which that it can be expressed in some sense. Now, the idea that you can sort of come to a new platform, develop a new edifice in which just the default assumption will be that it's an omni win-win or something like that, whatever that's supposed to mean. I still don't think that can ever be, I don't think that that's even psychologically possible. I don't think that in terms of, I don't think it's philosophically possible, because that would have to be defined, and I don't think you can define omni win-win. You can only define not. Like you can sort of subtract from a certain design elements of win-lose. You can contain them or transparently apprehend them in some commonly, with some kind of shared conventions and heuristics that allow for a kind of transparency and a kind of but in some sense, that's a kind of ongoing vigilance that you are making, sort of that you are making a kind of, it's part of a kind of an upkeep of a kind of individual responsibility, because you afford to people these powers of access to a kind of but that would still have to be worked cognitively, that people would still have to see that as part of their ambit of their accountability, and to sort of, that in some sense it would be a gain in agency so much more than when I say a gain in agency, I mean like an active participation would be deeper, and that would be the safeguard in the system, not the system itself, not the platform itself, but essentially just this kind of, that there are more operations that the individual has access to, in some sense, that is safeguarding them by their own functioning within the design. And the design, in some sense, is just a kind of convention. Now, if you believe that the system itself has somehow perfected omni-win-win, then I think it's almost guaranteed to be a kind of corrupt mess. Because if you think that the system sort of has inbuilt safeguards that aren't being, let's say, actively enforced by the agency of the participants, then you probably just have a kind of a group narrative, a self-deluding, sort of, but in some sense, and it's playing into this issue of sort of oversimplifying things, and sort of being actually it's a kind of, it manifests, I think, as a form of cognitive dissonance, and a kind of moral nescience as well. And it usually has to create all these weird sorts of image thinking, almost of, well, just my platform, my culture, my conventions mean this, rationally equates to this, and then they've got these whole sort of rational alignments of this oversimplified sort of symbolic interface with reality, which is, semi kind of psychotic, and in as much as that it even functions at all, it's a kind of like a group psychosis. And it's not capable of conserving its own functioning, and it usually sort of degrades very quickly within, within one generation. It's at its knees of destabilization and sort of implosion. Anyway, so what I'm trying to just spell out is that the win-lose rubric, in some sense, gives you the structure that you want to occlude or negate by private association or private action within its template. So it gives you something, it gives you a default to monitor, so that there is actually a tangible or a manifest medium in which people can forego the win-lose, and then it looks like that they're doing something different because they have forgone it, and it is the default. It's part of the template. So, I mean, I think that, a lot of the systems that already exist could be functioned, with just the right cultural ethos. Everything that we have is good enough. It really is. If people wanted to augment what the functions that they already do with just extra layers of coordination and a kind of, an intelligent form of kind of collaborative integration or something like that, in some sense, you could just add to what it already exists, and everything would probably be fine. Even with all even the stark conspiracy theories and the stark, sort of doomsday, predictions of certain, things that are causing problems. I mean, there are structures that are actually, I mean, you just have to identify which structures are actually capable of being good actors. I mean, in some sense, the problem is that you're trying to do the wrong thing with the wrong instrument. I mean, let me give you an example for sort of geopolitical world peace or something like that. I mean, like, the actual instrument of an integrated, peaceful, existence between nations would be essentially very strong NGOs, very well-funded NGOs that do the kind of governmental work which governments, in some sense, aren't allowed to do in their own country for their own people, in some sense, because, well, this is not necessarily true, but it's generally true that governments don't want to craft policy that essentially selects its participants in order to endow them with special benefits to help accelerate, development or something like that. Because if you have a special program that is very selective in who gets to be a candidate, to be a beneficiary, then it's kind of like, it looks like that you are intervening in the public sphere in a very uneven way, in that you are, giving some people a very large leg up, and you're not distributing the resources that the government has available to it in a kind of in an equitable way in terms of its citizenry at large. It's being, it's kind of like turning public services into a bit of a lottery, and there are just a few big winners, and everyone else kind of gets nothing, but they get sort of put into the lottery. But it's worse than a lottery, because a lottery is random, and this is going to be based on selective criteria, that some people are going to meet those criteria. So if you had NGOs do that kind of, let's say, developmental work, identifying people that have potential and essentially expand their opportunities and accelerate, their so it's that kind of very, that kind of creative engagement which a government can often not do within its own borders for its own people, but which NGOs could do, funded by foreign people, for foreign, in some sense, NGOs can perform many sort of governmental type functions and roles and services better, or at least within the current political climate, because you can't really have a platform in which you treat development in this kind of way, in this kind of, let's say, you can't have such an intelligent policy that doesn't look like it's sort of, that it's following the rubric of this kind of the zombie, like, egalitarian dogmatic creed of a kind of ideological, picturesque world in which everyone is exactly the same as everyone else, and everyone has the exact same potential as everyone else. Unless you sort of marching along to this kind of, weird sort of communistic, almost, sort of science fiction drivel, unless you are already sort of pushing that kind of agenda, you're not even allowed to kind of enter the gates, because journalists will basically pummel you to death, metaphorically speaking, with holding you accountable for anything that goes wrong with anyone, because you are helping some people more than others. It's that kind of lowest common denominator, kind of plutocratic drive to sort of keep the status quo and to limit essentially the expansion of essentially the intelligent scaling of the resources of the state in order to be a more powerful force for change. You're not able to run the state effectively, essentially. You're just ideologically not allowed to. The journalistic, sort of agenda of being sort of collusive with the kind of the revolutionary plutocratic ideological, sort of complex, as it were, which has always been the obstacle for progress. It's always been the major thing that has facilitated kleptocrats and corrupt politicians, has always been through the corruption of morality, which is essentially held by the journalistic, sort of element in society, that, in some sense they can't diagnose that they are the problem. By and large, they are what is keeping culture in the state that it is, in holding these issues to be insoluble and keeping these issues framed in such a way to make them politically inactionable, because of these kinds of, these moral confected confusions which are just make all the issues intractable, essentially. Um, and essentially, if anyone breaks the dogma of how those issues have been framed, then you just you join the witch hunt to bring them down. You know, and in some sense, that on a collective scale, we have to realize where that comes from on the individual scale, which really has to do with the psychological state of individuals and the low state that psyche is in. I mean, we have to realize that a lot of people, they live in a narrative. They live in some form of false religion. They live in some kind of sort of group psychosis most of the time. And that is how they navigate. That is how they make sense of the world. And if they didn't have that polemic, if they didn't have that cerebral histrionic tendency of that kind of groupthink, they would consider themselves lost or impoverished that much more, not belonging to that kind of faction of right beliefs or something like that they have the right set of beliefs. And they have no sort of intelligent means to kind of curate their own belief system or to question their own beliefs, and make them analytically, put them in alignment with a kind of purpose-driven thing, because their purpose is essentially just to kind of repeat the narrative, to drum out opposition. And in as much as that many conventions in society, many of the buzzwords, many of the things that you hear repeated in the news cycle, and the weird kind of hypothetical arguments that they leverage, the weird kind of, it's weird how when you're dealing with an issue, that the people who are always on the right side of the issue are always leveraging this kind of very specious form of doubt, this very sort of cherry-picked skepticism. That how come all the skeptical questions always line up on the one side of the issue and you hear nothing from the other side? The Democratic Party has been functioning this way for a long time, and in some sense, I do really blame the Democrats for the state of politics. They really are the worst party, and in some sense, people aren't even taking this opportunity. I'm talking about American politics. I'm not even American, but you can't expect a party when it's winning to change. You should really hope that it changes while it's losing. So, people should be taking this opportunity to hope that the Democrats continue to lose so that they can actually reinvent themselves as a political creature, as it were. I mean, the Republicans, for all the inertia that exists in politics, the Republicans as a winning party have been undergoing a bit of an internal renaissance, to the extent that such a thing is even possible. So even as the Republicans are winning, they are through the guise of Trump, they are making better ground in terms of updating their political compass to some degree. The Democrats are so far away from, they're doing the opposite of this. And to the extent to which that, sadly, I mean, the Republicans, I would say the biggest thing that the Republicans suffer from is that they don't have authentic opponents. They've just got a groupthink to deal with. So that they've got nothing they've got nothing to drive their game. They've got nothing to compete. They've got no competition to drive a kind of a finer, more realistic policy in some sense. But even as they have essentially no ideological competition other than essentially insanity, the insanity of the Democrats, they are still making better moves at, let's say, some kind of real political regeneration of a kind of consciousness and conscientiousness or whatever. And the Democrats just get more and more insane. But and essentially all they can do is leverage more groupthink and leverage more, sort of utter nonsensical polarizing, narratives or whatever. And by controlling this kind of orthodox groupthink, which most people hopefully have tuned out, sort of switched off, or just begin to identify and ignore as just being utter drivel. But, if anything, this opportunity is completely being lost if it's not directed at essentially incisively critiquing the Democrats and their vacuousness. And frankly, their by and large sort of insanity of just the kind of the insoluble race baiting, sort of ethno-fascistic, it's a weird kind of social justice is a weird kind of transnational ethno-fascistic moral paradigm, in which moral consideration vests in the faction, in the identity, and that the real interest of that faction must be pandered to by political power. And in some sense, they don't overtly call for an ethno-fascistic, but they want a kind of rainbow Hitler that arbitrates between the identity factions and a kind of world government. It has that kind of as I say, from a moral perspective, they have a kind of ethno-fascist transnational vision, which means that they can still sort of have this kind of fake municipal politics, but it's so delusional, and it's so obsessed with just kind of repeating and insulating its own kind of sort of group psychosis. That it becomes this kind of the self-fulfilling prophecy, justifying more and more psychopathy in its sort of rabid defense of its kind of reactionary narrative. And the more power it gets, the more it creates the problems that it complains about. And it ironically takes no accountability for it. It just disperses that responsibility into the systemic narrative. So it's a self-aggravating, self-fueling dumpster fire. So there's definitely I don't think the Democratic Party can. I do think you need an entirely new party. I don't think it can be redeemed. I don't think it can be restructured. I think it's too far gone. And in some sense, hopefully it never wins another election. And eventually, after enough losses, someone will make a new party from nothing. That might be actually the most ideal novation in politics, because then if the Democrats can actually, if the people that come to displace the Democrats can actually enter into a new realm of politics, into a new epoch, a new, then I guess you can actually start to see real politics from the Republican side. Because, you can't expect the Republicans to do everything by themselves. You can't expect them when they essentially don't really have an authentic opposition. They just have a kind of fake news opposition. That all they do is leverage noise without any substance. Okay, this is an important addendum to the transition sort of intellectual commentary and opinion that I have on this section of man, this is I have to sort of say this in waves, because the point that I want to make is pretty nuanced, and I don't really have the resources of articulation to kind of do it perfectly on the first round. So I'm just going to sort of yeah, this is going to seem like an unfair sort of lumping in of certain things, but I think that this is kind of relevant, and I'm going to use Marxism as a kind of illustration of an ideological, of the perniciousness of ideological narratives and the trap that they lay, but also how ideology is an important tool and instrument to getting through problems and things like that. So I'm going to explore the toxicity of Marxism and describe how Marxism is, and the perniciousness in certain kinds of intellectualism and ideological possession um, creep in to narrative frameworks, and how to be conscious of these things and transcend them. So in the same way that I've described the people in transition being somewhat like proselytizing a kind of a Borg sort of vision, um, yeah, it's analogous to Marxism. Now, I have considered myself a Marxist, but I think that at some point I'm going to have to sort of neaten that up or revise it myself, a Marxist analysis, because I don't follow the general formulation that is sort of the mainstream Marxist idea. But I'm so let me just comment on it a bit obtusely. But in some sense, you can see this toxicity even within Noam Chomsky, this kind of ideological rigidity. I don't think Noam Chomsky sort of strictly defines himself as a Marxist, but I'm sure he uses the Marxist analysis, and this comes across when he is narrating the situation, where he has this reach of clarity from sort of having this factual objective certitude in the observations that he makes about sort of plotting and tracking the political landscape. And essentially, I mean, basically what he is doing is he's relying on something like class consciousness. He's relying on a paradigm. Now, what gives one the ability to clearly see things as being real is a teleological framework. You have class consciousness is able to tell you what is going on, what things are in the present. It's able, but you're only allowed to have that idea of what things are because you have a vision as to where they should be going to. So you have an overarching understanding that gets into a realm of a kind of a purpose-driven compass, which then allows you to solidify your conclusion about what is going on. And then you can kind of subtract where we should be going from what things are, and then you kind of, you have a kind of rationale which has this kind of infused teleos purpose uh, um, woven into it. And that's a kind of cohesive worldview. Now, Marxist analysis, in its kind of idealism and reductionism, like I've even considered myself a Marxist because, like the overarching, kind of ideal, uh, uh, the reductionism, I think is a useful thing. That one should have a purposeful mindset and framework of analysis, but one needs to be able to transcend it at the same time and sort of be able to incorporate other things. And in some sense, Marx was even sort of denoted that as being very important, that the theory would have to be updated in some sense. And the thing that has to be updated is the hypothesis. The Marxist hypothesis you have to keep an eye on the Marxist hypothesis, that you cannot just sort of use class consciousness as a blunt way of narrating what reality is, without at the same time building in a kind of sensitivity to the caveat that Marxist ideology is founded on, which is the Marxist hypothesis. And in some sense, I guess Marxists then fall into two camps, and there's almost no one in my camp, let's just say, and everyone's in the former camp of people that are willing to take the Marxist hypothesis on faith, and they're not willing to test it. And I think that in that sense, they they prove to not even be real Marxists. And I think even Noam Chomsky falls into this camp, where he's not willing to test the Marxist hypothesis, he's willing to take it on faith. And then that becomes a blind faith, and the whole thing becomes toxic. I think Marxism proves to be compelling in as much as that it's interested in making itself susceptible to falsifiability, um, and the purpose should be contingent on the caveat being surmounted. Uh, uh, and so, in as much as that Marxists are willing to engage with the hypothesis, and then they are acting in good faith, rather than essentially just trying to be sort of subversive, self-fulfilling prophets of, essentially, I mean, you get these paradoxes where, let me just state what the Marxist hypothesis is. So the Marxist hypothesis is, and in some sense, this is analogous to my critique of some of the substance that I've already brought up in the transition, that that the win-lose template is not necessarily what the problem is. And in some sense, the template might actually be a default that needs to be preserved because of what I've generally described as a kind of noetic feature that the mind requires. Otherwise, you're just sort of building sandcastles to be knocked down by the sea, to be transformed by the action of the waves. And that trust is not something that will be established as an edifice, that it will be an ongoing pursuit and will always have its dynamic challenges. And those challenges are perhaps obscured by impoverishing us of the default template, which must be regarded as persisting, so that a high trust culture can emerge within it authentically, rather than trying to sort of wish itself into believing that it can be a kind of a state that is inhabited, rather than an activity that is coordinated actively in an ongoing. So in some sense, the lack of the lack of treating it as something that needs to be imported into reality in a kind of piecemeal, in a gradient scale of activity that creates its own culture surrounding it, rather than a kind of sort of solid transitional establishment, is in some sense the kind of, I think, almost the toxic, the idea that it isn't already just happening organically and growing organically, and the failure of essentially the embryo to even start to gestate and to take form, is in some sense the false consciousness that that you're going to know it when you see it, and that it's going to happen all at once, and that it's going to break with the culture because it will be a new culture. Is this kind of false dichotomy in the mind that essentially that a new way will be a solid junction that is disparate from the old template, when in some sense it will not be so. It will be a concerted, consistent derogation of the existing template that it will be inculcated within. And that dynamic, I think, there's a kind of vigilance, there's a kind of long suffering, and there's a kind of reality in that, which is not quite the same as what I think they might have in mind in terms of what they have on offer when they say, game B or something like that. I think it might be a different sort of animal to what they were thinking of when they were thinking of game B. Okay. And this, I do think, is the same kind of problem that you have with the so-called Marxists, which I don't even think are real Marxists. And in some sense, I think that so much as they suffer from the same thing, in some sense, I am making this general claim that these people are not really. I don't mean this in a nasty way, because certainly these people are closer than anyone else that I can see talking about this. But they're not really sort of. I don't want to say that they're not serious about game B, but I want to say that they're not being real about it, or they're not being real enough. So that's basically my point. They're not being serious enough about it, in some sense. They're not being actually deep enough about it. So, okay, so I don't mean to make ad hominems. I'm making sort of substantive claims. But anyway, and just to complete the sort of the metaphor, let me just go into critiquing Marxists and or so-called Marxists, because it's analogous and parallel to sort of people who talk about game B but essentially aren't already playing it at a serious level, something like that. Not as if they're not doing real important work that is an important precursor in some sense, but anyway. Or isn't a useful sort of catalyst, or perhaps a springboard for developing the confidence to start doing something. So, I mean, the problem with Marxists is because they're not willing to test the hypothesis, because they just want to believe in it rather than test it. They're not comfortable believing on it. It's not strong enough for them to believe on it, so they try to believe in it instead, and then they believe in the narrative, and then they believe in sort of consecutive, a sequential series of then beliefs become apparent as being rationally aligned with that narrative, and that's what they try to push. So, and essentially this comes into the sort of the self-fulfilling prophecy, sort of subversive, doom prophet, sort of thing, where they're trying to weaken the system in order to demoralize it. So essentially they become these merchants of destabilization and demoralization. And they also, they don't see the wood from the trees. And, I mean, you see this with so-called Marxist thinkers all the time, where they are constantly trying to leverage unintelligent solutions that are just there to kind of prove the decadence and the extravagance that the system is doomed anyway. But they're not willing to test that hypothesis that is capitalism inevitable to be to render itself obsolete, to make itself unworkable. And you see this when they sort of attack small businesses. They're like, well, why should we even like small businesses? They don't pay very good wages. They don't pay very good benefits to their employees. Yeah, I read a thread. It was quite interesting and showed sort of all this kind of supposedly so-called Marxist propaganda against small businesses. But I mean, most small businesses are actually, they're much poorer. you know, than big corporations. If big corporations make a shop somewhere and then the shop doesn't do well, then they maybe they just close that shop, and they have perhaps better collective infrastructure. They've got the benefit so uh, the benefit of a large scale operation to be able to suss out better before they make a store if the store will be profitable enough for them to be worth it. They'll have better metrics. They'll have a formula that they can sort of leverage. Smaller businesses don't have any of these benefits, and they often, where the small business exists, a corporation would perhaps not be operating that same level of service that the commercial activity provides in that situation, in that place. Um, and so, to a large extent, small businesses are just sort of endemically uh, not as rich, and therefore they often represent the even lower rungs on the socioeconomic sort of spectrum, and sort of trying to penalize small businesses for being poorer effectively is just like saying, well, we should abolish the poor in some sense. Um, we should outlaw it. Um, Everyone should have corporate jobs that have benefits. It's sort of it's it's that level of sort of decadent wish fulfillment or whatever. But in some sense, it's the idea. Well, imagine if there was fuller employment and there were more rungs on the socioeconomic ladder, and things were more vibrant, and there was a higher velocity of money and things like that. I mean, I wonder if maybe the diminution of small business isn't a way to almost and the freezing of the system, so that you can't get authentic capitalism, because capitalism might be able to sort of to save itself to some degree, that a different form of non-kleptocracy or whatever, of big corporate players protected by governments and things like that, and a more uh, if you have a flaw in an economy, you're able to I mean, many of the problems that we suffer from today is that there is no floor to wages, and so um, because there's no authentic floor in wages other than artificial measures like minimum wage, the economy kind of stays in this limbo of never having a kind of authentic labor market, which means that you can't get like an authentic growth in wages, because you just believe that essentially that time is no longer, in some sense. I mean, obviously in some sectors and some industries, um, there are shortages of certain kinds of work, and therefore you actually have a functioning price signal and market for labor. Um, but because essentially that can't be permitted to generally take hold in the economy at large, you have this general lagging of real earnings. Which is something that I think could be ameliorated by abolishing the minimum wage and just having more small businesses and more employment in general, and a more dynamic labor market that was more particular at differentiating between that people aren't just generic sources of labor, that we have a higher degree of conceptualizing the value that labor can provide to a business, that essentially labor becomes less generic and becomes more particularized. And in some sense, I think small businesses particularly are the engine of doing that, are the engine of valuing a kind of idiocentric uh, idiocentric features and character traits. And I mean, it's also often a breeding ground for developing new forms of commerce. Like small businesses are really like the experimentation zone for generating new niches. And in as much as that we have heard small businesses and through the general sort of overarching features of economic life that have become the debt industry and things like that, which prevents people from having more entrepreneurial projects and things like that, and just makes the economy itself like fundamentally sort of neutered and less vibrant, and more prone to kind of corporate displacement of commerce, because there's less turnover, there's less what do they call it? Industries are being developed through corporations and their unfolding business models, not through disruptors. There's less variety because of the curb of small businesses and things like that. And in some sense, I think that it's been part of the what I would even call it, the artificial maturation of capitalism. And in some sense, people who already want to say, oh, well, it's doomed, it's doomed, it's doomed because of these technical things, in some sense, I don't think we can even honestly say that. I think that, we and there also might be shades of solution, which are not predictable in some sense. But I think we have to at least be intellectually honest enough to be open to being proven one way or the other. And to the extent to which we're not, there's a kind of the whole thing feels just a bit too rigged. Just to conveniently usher us into a kind of ideological narrative that will become the basis of a kind of a new group psychosis. And I do think that there are also other interesting solutions in some sense, which is what I've kind of, maybe I need to come up with the term with it, but a kind of autarky of a private organization, which is a kind of pseudo commune, but is kind of orchestrated through a kind of membership in a kind of, it would probably have to take the form of some kind of legal entity, which that's where the rubber hits the road. Like, how are you going to structure that legal entity? How is it going to be able to cement trust in its institutional foundation? How is it going to structure it? And this is a problem. This is a very, very human problem, and it can't just be wished away. How is trust expressed and maintained? I mean, because it's almost, when you start creating police functions, if you have too many, I mean, and you have ultimate ones and you have ones that trump other ones, it's sort of, it it's probably good to have some transparent oversight and then some kind of arbitration function. But if your arbitration function at the end of the day is a plebiscite, um, you've perhaps maybe you only find out 30 years later, but you've created a kind of uh, a machine that's very capable of derailing itself. That's self-deluding itself in a kind of systematic unaccountability and irresponsibility, of sheltering its trajectory under under convenient ideology, um, and you have the same kind of corruption and kind of strange form of sort of pseudo plutocracy. I mean, I think even what we live under today, I would even call a pseudo plutocracy, because I believe that it's orchestrated um, by the people, not by the elites. I think that the elites are less to blame than are the people. I think what we suffer from is a rotten culture, not from rotten elites. Um, and people don't have the function. They don't have the ability, in some sense, to locate the right intellectual elites to what's the word, to endorse. They're not responsible. They don't. The culture doesn't hold itself responsible for and in some sense, how can you expect a civilization to thrive when the people are frankly demand to be led like cattle? You can't expect good outcomes, and to the extent to which that culture is not willing to take on this role and function, that is the cause. Everything else is a secondary symptom of the ill that we are experiencing, is the lack of a sophistication in culture. Um, I mean, to a large extent as well, I think perhaps we have to target our ire at journalists and the weakness of journalists and their intellectual um, corrosion of agency and self-determinism in terms of how they have treated the political class, how they blame the political class for everything, for every tragedy, for there is this. Uh, if something bad happens, it's because you didn't keep the safety of us as your highest priority, and so you have this uh, security-driven long march to a vast concentration and centralization of all power that's sort of fear-mongered under the guise of this fake and impossible sort of moral absolutism as being the kind of the vanguard of a proto-totalitarian culture. Anyway, and in some sense, for the quest for simplicity in reality and clarity in reality, I think that we can self-delude and create more problems. And I do think that, and that's why I call what I saw in transition a kind of proselytizing towards a Borg concept, and that it is a bit too idealistic. But I mean, those ideal categories are not unuseful. They are a way of taking the temperature of essentially the intellectual project, uh, but that's like a general instrument that's like kind of it's kind of like a precursor. It's kind of like a catalytic instrument. It's not a serious instrument. But perhaps it's an important conduit to getting people into the culture, for inducting them into the actual, the sort of the serious update that gets them active in a serious and real way. I should say as well that, a lot of the stuff that I'm saying about narrative, I go into deeper when I'm talking about cerebral histrionics and things like that, which I'm not going to be able to reiterate all of that, because it's in hours and hours and hours of lecturing about psychology and narratives and things like that. But just to reiterate the general point, that I think the way to actually transcend narrative, because you can't escape it, but you have to transcend it, and you can't have it be your guiding compass. It becomes a kind of unimportant container of what it is that you are doing, because it's not the thing that you are tracking. That one will generate a narrative because it will be a kind of woven into your appreciation of what things are, which has to have a teleos, it has to have a purpose. So your purpose framework will give you contact into a reality of what is going on in the present. And your interaction with what's going on in the present and the unfolding of the present will abstractly be able to be abstractly be able to be sort of mapped as a narrative progression in some sense. But as soon as you are seduced or transfixed or hypnotized by such a paradigm, you've really completely lost the plot. You've been incepted into your own. You've believed your own purpose a bit too blindly. The purpose must be couched against or couched within a more general idea of, well, you might be wrong. You might not believe that you are wrong, but you have to concede that you might be wrong. I mean, this is so trite. It's not worth reiterating all the time. I mean, essentially, when you're dealing with someone who knows that they might be wrong, so they have to take things seriously. Obviously, that doesn't mean that they have to find seriousness in everything that looks like it might be counter to their view. I mean, at some point, there's a kind of there are kind of heuristics of discipline of one cannot just extravagantly indulge in a never-ending skepticism. That is also a kind of that's a different kind of sort of dilution of essence and dispersal of reason, where it just kind of bleeds out into a kind of into a seriousness about such a broadness of experience which is inappropriate to an individual, that you are an individual, and the idea that you're going to sort of have a God's eye point of view because you're going to take on the perspective of the entire collective is also, it's ungrounded. And this, I think, is part of the kind of the hypnotism of some of this idealism, is that no, the justice owed to the collective and the perspective of the collective is so useful and simple and canonical and reductive that it must become the overriding principle. It must become the overriding theme of governance. And that will that style of narrative, because that in some sense is the idea that the narrative comes before having a canonical narrative, therefore becomes the guiding principle of everything, and everything is balanced according to that. And that kind of balance is certainly the kind of the gilded cage of Sophia, and is woven into it this knowledge of good and evil, which has to be agreed upon, which is an impossible ask, because in some sense it means that everyone has to be dead in the same way, and you become this kind of this agent of a consumer. You become, if you will, a Death Eater. And that becomes the characteristic of your influence within the system. And you are operating within a system, just as much as you're operating within the auspices of a narrative that gives you your image morality, your sort of your rationally aligned, sort of sequitur worldview. And again, like these are elements that I saw in the transition video, and they are certainly forgivable, because these are complicated sort of issues, and they do need to be, I think, upgraded to some degree with some of the insights that hopefully I'm sharing about it. Following from everything else that I've just said, I'm just going to give a kind of an outline of the roadmap of a possible synthesis of how you kind of use the things that I have been speaking about. So, using essentially a more complex model of contending and enshrining and a more complex target to hit, then you can do some sort of purposeful magic, some teleological paradigm sort of transcendence, where, because essentially you're trying to fulfill this recipe that I have used the made-up word noesis, that then you're not afraid to use things like win-lose templates. Maybe you design a win-lose paradigm, which is not meant to go on forever, but it's meant to expire. It's meant to sort of it's meant to sort of have a self-terminating point. And after that self-terminating point is reached, there's another one to take its place. There's another win-lose paradigm, which then is and essentially what I'm talking about is a kind of, that these are games, that you are inventing these things as games to be participated in, and they have a kind of a cross-purpose amalgamated sort of paradigm, which is something like the noesis that is being fulfilled. And so you're actually you're engaging, you're creating these things for people to interface with, for people to effectively, on a meta level, be coordinating with each other through, in which they are conserving this overarching, let's say, complex situation of noesis. And it's a creative, artful thing. I mean, in some sense, this is, the archetype or the ideal of what elites or leaders would do, in a less regimented, hierarchical sort of way, in sort of like the center is very good at reading the temperature of the whole, but it's not the top is directing the bottom, although it does have it's more like the center is a manifestation of a temperature reading of the whole, and is trying to correct it, but not through a kind of command approach, but through creating an interface which is open to be engaged in. That is, and in some sense, there's a kind of there's a plenary, divisive technological, sort of science that's going on in terms of making sure that these things that are in the mix sort of balance each other out, or conserve each other in some greater sort of sense, and that you're constantly creating niches that are being sorry, it's not that you're creating the niche, but you're creating a manifestation of the niche that already exists to exercise itself, to discharge its so you're contending to a psychological entity in some sense. Now, this also has its own problem. It also has its own looming, nothing is without defect, nothing is without a kind of a doom spiral that could attach to it if it is used robotically. In some sense, one might hope that this might eventually seed to a more conscious intervention in which the meta discussion as to how these niches should be constructed should perhaps even be fielded. There should be a kind of that essentially it starts to involve people in the decision-making process of how to devise it. People get more creative in terms of constructing the manifestation of these niches to discharge whatever there is to be discharged, which could be a whole array of it's sort of like we're playing a game to learn something, we're playing a game to develop something, we're playing a game to better feel like the culture is on top of that thing, has digested that thing, has familiarized itself with the consequences inherent in that thing. And I mean, you can see that culture, to a greater or lesser extent, organically performs this function already. I'm just basically saying that this would be a more conscious culture that would be growing in its consciousness of, let's say, the technology that culture is to itself, and essentially bringing the culture into an accessible, honest, and transparent process instead of an unconscious one. And using culture, it's obviously not necessarily the solution and answer to everything and anything, but to a large extent, it is a vicarious psychological organ that needs to be brought into alignment with an internal organization or an internal psychological schema that is capable of contending with its internal self-reflection, its internal reality in such a way that it does not generate a kind of nescient cognitive dissonance that is being collectively covered over by a kind of a collective psychosis, which is currently what we have. And I do think that the psychological reading of this problem is, let's say, the most nuanced, the most important key to essentially the problem of the crisis that we face as humans, and as a civilization. But in some sense, we have to recognize that the former is the pivotal obstacle, and has always been such. And our unwillingness to contend with that and take it seriously, and take it the most seriously in some sense, is, you could argue, excusable. But excuses need to be at some point rebuked. We need to displace excuses with blame, because blame is the precursor of self-determinism and agency, and consciousness. And the light of reason, the light of understanding. If we cannot yoke ourselves to that authority, then perhaps we deserve the beastly fate of the narrative imprint that we have been conditioned by the exterior, but that we have merely that we must be hidden and camouflaged by the environment, that we must be a part of the world. It's really sort of that simple. There are basically two ways of going about it, although there's a multitude of nefarious, malevolent, self dispersed, abrogation of the responsibility to self-realization. But we have to also realize that the process of self-realization is an organic one, and it is a noetic one. That it is both heavy in its alternative, but it's also light in its in its actual objects and contents, and that lightness has been described, at least by an author, is an unbearable even burden that has often given way into more narrative inception. It's a peculiar tightrope to walk, to find one's way towards the kingdom. Anyway, I don't want to elaborate too much on the poetry of that, because, I wove that into one of the end recordings that I made about cerebral histrionics. Anyway, okay, so yeah. Anyway, I guess that's pretty much all the substance that I have to bring to bear on this topic. There are some further points that are worth raising, because they help to elaborate also some detail and things like that. And some of these nuances that I'm talking about, I don't wish to sort of. This is not an indictment against people that were taking place in the transition, conversation, discussion, sort of lecture space, and some of the aspects of this nuance was somewhat calibrated. I did hear, elements of this, but this is in order to sort of in a more profound way, perhaps in a deeper way, in a more solid way, getting into the aspects of what it would mean to leave game A as a metaphor, using the leaving game A as a metaphor, because entering into complexity, into an actual complex system that's properly respected as that, is not actually leaving game A, which is my general overarching sort of thesis in some sense. Okay, so another way of sort of describing the hypothesis, so in the same ways that to be, I would say, an authentic and a good transcendental, kind of Marxist analyst that's actually not just doing more of the same problem, because in some sense, look, obviously, if you're going to transition to anything, you need to have a faith. You need to have a shared faith. The problem is, I mean, that's a prerequisite to having a culture, to having a society, is you have to have some kind of cultural or some kind of consensus around something like faith. Faith is indispensable. The problem is that a bad faith will do. A narrative that portends a blind faith will also service that, and then essentially it'll just be as good as the last battle that it precipitated out of, or that it is the historical residue of. In some sense, this is like the Marxist recipe of how, if you don't actually, what's the word? My word. If you don't actually resolve the material dialectism, in some sense, I'm sympathetic to and I call even myself a Marxist analyst, but in some sense I'm slightly more Hegelian than that, because I see it more as Hegel did, as an immaterial thing of the mind, of the mental realm of consciousness, and then and that in some sense the physical manifestation is a subset of that mental process, and it does have certain feedback. It does hold certain charge that then can overturn the whole apple cart, and then in the dialectical material, in some sense, dialectical materialism is just a sort of, it's a way of depicting failure conditions. It's a way of depicting essentially, well, if you don't transcend the epoch authentically, then you're doomed to repeat it. You're doomed to just go into an earlier cycle or something like that. So anyway, I'm sort of sympathetic to both, intellectually speaking. But yeah, so the problem, the hypothesis that I'm saying is the problematic narrative in some sense that might be the beginnings of a bad faith, although I do think that the people involved in this discussion are sensitive to this, is that if game A becomes the bad thing that you are trying to escape from, that you just need to leave game A, that essentially the hypothesis is that, well, is it actually authentic that you can just demonize game A? Or in some sense, the problem is it will become a semantic problem, that if you want to make that as a canonical metaphor, and that is the overarching game, or the overarching aim of a not game A system, is to not be game A. If that is the only sort of purpose or something like that, then it becomes a kind of a semantic shell game in which you keep the narrative alive by sort of re-identifying elements of game A that you are leaving, and that you are the sort of the perpetual civil war of any kind of ideologically driven sort of collective psychosis, because it's based in an image, it's based in a narrative that you are trying to leave game A. And so in some sense, I think the hypothesis, which is analogous to the Marxist hypothesis, which I said you're only a true Marxist if you are actually willing to test the hypothesis instead of just believing in it blindly in some sense. And in the same way, we have to test the hypothesis that game A is actually the problem, and that it's not actually a kind of that the problem can never be reductive in that frame. That reduction can never actually. There's actually I want to segue into criticizing Bret Weinstein, because I see him doing much the same thing when he's talking about race and the problem of the system, and I do think that he's making a similar kind of oversimplification. I was listening to him having an interview with is it Zuby, or I don't think there's an M in there, Zuby, Zuby, and the problem with Bret's perspective is that he keeps on relying on this insoluble reduction, which is essentially, which puts the cart before the horse, and which makes it impossible to tackle anything, because you have to sort of fix the situation for people, deriding them of agency and responsibility. And it also, by reifying that very bad narrative, which is actually false, that has layers of oversimplification which are unjustifiable, in some sense the idea that, well, look, because some people are kleptocratic and they have found a way to unfairly shelter themselves from bad luck and to divert it onto other people, that because essentially that process can be in a very intellectually dishonest, generalized way, be obscured by categories of race, that then you can justify a kind of a narrative of systemic oppression that has to do with race, when essentially the solution to much of that systemic oppression, because in some sense these are separable issues, the systemic oppression issue and the distribution of bad luck issue are wholly separable. And to sort of conflate those two in order to kind of bolster this sort of cosmological moral claim for needing to tackle systemic racism in a kind of holistic way, which in some sense, it has this insoluble quality to it, that it can only be solved by a really deeply intervening, infantilizing political sort of paternalism, which completely abrogates the issue of accountability and self-determinism and agency. And, in some sense, I think it also, a lot of his, his generalized oversimplification of the problem falls short in many places. And it is actually more of a cultural problem than he is alluded to, but in his reduction, there's no accounting of culture whatsoever, and there's no responsibility. And I'll just give an example of this. His idea essentially that because so many people in the black community are just the males are imprisoned, then because there are fewer males left over, that essentially the sexual marketplace or the relationship marketplace is so out of whack in terms of that it's stacked against women, that essentially the standards within the the culture, it becomes even more toxic for family values and for like proper it becomes even more unstable, and it sort of confects into a systemic problem, which in some sense, because you can give an explanation that it was historically caused, it's somehow everyone inherits responsibility for it instead of the people participating in it, which is a wholly insoluble, and essentially, and then he tries to sort of curb that problem by simply saying, well, because we know that luck is unfairly distributed between the 1% and the 99%, and because the 1% can sort of be vaguely associated with whiteness, then somehow the kind of the racial politics gets reified and the narrative gets validated when it does not deserve any of that. And although that these things might have had a racial component in the historical construction, how they persist and how they are reconstructed in the present has nothing to do with race. It really doesn't. It has to do with the lack of agency and self-determinism and actual policies that are willing to deal with the problem being the lack of agency and self-determinism. And this the idea that there are some people that are kleptocrats and that have sort of colluded to stop bad luck from visiting on them, and it's been redistributed throughout the system, that is a wholly separable issue. Come on. Okay, so that is very important. Let's not forgive people their disgusting oversimplifications, which lead them to insoluble narratives, and inculcate a culture which is fundamentally toxic and will never develop anything, will never even develop an authentic political framework in order to see possible solutions. Now, the other aspect of this is culture itself, the actual toxicity within, let's say, the black subculture to a large extent, which has a lot to do with women, which has a lot to do with a kind of toxic feminism and stereotypes and things like that. And these things are more psychological, and so psychological manifestations. We have a history of, even Sam Vaknin does this, where he reifies these identity belief structures to some degree, where he concedes that, oh well, women have been enslaved for 10,000 years. These disgusting oversimplifications, which lead us to the same kind of insoluble mess that is becomes a confection which is just impossible to get anywhere, because we'll never have a common judgment. We'll never have shared values and a shared basis with which to have an authentic enough culture that's capable of making headway or heads or tails of anything. It's just languished in this in the narrative, which is basically the cultural manifestation of the psychopathy, which essentially gets exhibited on the individual psychological level, and it's making room for that psychopathy by giving it cover by this narrative. Because I'll say that the problem really is in a lot of women, a lot of these single mothers. They are the production facility of this ongoing, never-ending toxicity to a large degree, and a lot of male energy and masculinity is shaped by these women to be toxic. And it's not so much that the men, I think, are absent from the situation, and so the men that are involved are bad. That essentially men are actually very malleable within any kind of society, and they are often at pains to shape themselves in whatever is being demanded of them and expected of them, which is generally a female consensus. And to the extent to which that we don't appreciate the level to which culture is toxic and culture is recreating this, is another sort of idea that essentially the woman cannot be inspected, cannot be invigilated. that their character cannot be impugned, that they are beyond reproach, they are beyond rebuke. And that is, I think, the basis of this cultural toxicity to a large extent. Um, that because we have robbed them of agency and we've made them conditioned by a system in some narrative, we give them cover to continually uh, um, yeah, I mean, and these cultural problems are independent of a lot of these structural things. They really are. I mean, in the same way that you can have the same socioeconomic circumstances and have very, very different things that occur, and that is all because of culture. I mean, you can have Islamic extremists who create terrorist cells and try to destabilize a political community so as to import their overarching narrative as being the canonical thing that guides progress in the world. Because it's basically an ideological construct. And in the same way that these ideological constructs have been given free rein over the subculture that has made up Black America as just one example, and these toxic subcultures have existed. I mean, the archetypal example that I like to use of this, which I don't mean to be incendiary or whatever, because I see this as a purely manifestation of nothing to do with ethnicity, but just to do with a kind of cultural outgrowth, is like the Italian sort of mafia style of subculture and criminality and sort of dignifying that it in a kind of in a victim narrative that, oh well, we wanted to be good businessmen but we weren't accepted by the community, so we had to get guns and violence and sell them protection. There was no alternative. I mean, this is an age-old, this is a perennial manifestation, which is just it's a niche which exists within human culture, that you can create a subculture. It's very problematic when this toxic kind of subculture tries to take over. It's very good at painting itself as the underdog. It's very bad when the underdog, when the sort of parasitic underdog mentality sort of actually gets too big, becomes the big fish in the pond or whatever. It kind of takes over the environment because it's not capable of stewarding anything. It's not capable of it has to actually exist as a kind of symbiotic parasite in order to safeguard its own sort of psychopathy, in order to sort of insulate its psychopathy and dress it up as a kind of dignified response to a narrative. You have to reify the narrative, and then you get these people who are helping them do that. And I think that's the problem with Bret's. Like, it's not as if there isn't some truth in a reduction like that. In some general formulaic way, you can probably find some people who magically find themselves to be purely the victim of other people's influence and circumstance and conditions. But when does the actual bones of structure ever sort of get imported into the mix, ever get actualized, ever sort of, when does the agency ever start its engine? It's sort of this becomes the problem, is that when you use these reductive analyses and you don't temper them properly with a proper understanding that blame is the gateway, is the portal of power. If you blame somebody else, you give your power away, you give your agency away, you learned helplessness. So yeah, I just wanted to. Now I hope it's not. It's Zuby or Zumbi. I don't know if it's got an M in it. Anyway, but yeah, I wanted to say that about Bret Weinstein. And look, it is, this has been the liberal dog and pony show forever, that you can create these very sophisticated, obtuse things that kind of reduce agency to nothing almost, and because then you've confected a problem which actually has a structural. Well, it's useful to do that if there is actually a design maneuver that solves the problem. But if there isn't a design maneuver that solves that problem, it's almost a kind of intellectual masturbation. and it's another way of, in a very obtuse way, saying, well, if this problem never existed, we would have all been better off. Which is like almost a kind of, like a kind of history denial, or a way to sort of, well, if we can make this a kind of an inherited historical problem, then somehow that like makes it easier to deal with it because it doesn't have any moral charge anymore, because you can kind of impoverish essentially in the narrative contemplative paradigm, you can impoverish and discharge this issue of accountability. Essentially you can and I do see Bret as actually intellectually dishonestly conflating these two issues. Saying, well, because some very few people in the 1% have found a way to shield themselves from bad luck, that somehow all whiteness or all white people somehow inherit some kind of help from that, when they certainly do not. The 99% are all in the same boat in terms of the kind of collusion and protection from bad luck that he is talking about. So the idea that like somehow that this reinforces a kind of systemic oppression which is specifically experienced by a certain group of people because of history. Well, yeah, history is messy. And we're not going to like eviscerate and hollow out more of the middle to make room for this kind of top-down command, sort of. In some sense, it's almost as if people just don't want to confront the actual task ahead of solving the actual problem on the ground. That is it is slow, it's not easy, and it's actually made more difficult by changing the character of the problem, because then it's it's less charged, because in some sense, if you try to direct blame towards these people that are participating in a toxic culture, because blame is the solution and the beginning of agency, then essentially you might get into a conflagration in which you are kind of charging up the reactionariness of what essentially things like Black Lives Matter actually is. It's a vastly reactionary movement. I'll just describe it again as I always do. It's basically the morality of ethno-fascism, but within a transnational paradigm, where the identity faction is itself the ethno-fascist nation, and although it's not housed within an ethno-nationalistic municipal politics, they want politicians to kind of arbitrate over identity factions and to pander to them and to the real interests that only belong to identity factions. So essentially it's real politics for identity and not for nations. So it's kind of like a transnational ethno-fascism where the nation is the identity, and they want all politicians to be a kind of rainbow Hitler that arbitrates between those real interests. And they are the only things that are allowed to have real interests, is those factions. But it's the same morality as ethno-fascism. It's completely reactionary. And every time it is given an inch of reification and validation of its narrative, and its beginnings, which was feminism, which was, fourth wave feminism was this mentality. It was this reductionism. And this is why I'm so incensed when I see Sam Vaknin reifying it and somewhat and saying that, it needs to be worked out on that, within that paradigm, which is not going to happen, because we will never have a shared value system. We'll never have a shared morality. We'll never have a common judgment, a common notion of justice. If we don't have a common notion of justice, there is no shared society. You basically have this fractured, divisive, ethno-fascistic morality, which has been largely imported, and the left is prone to it because it's prone to these narratives, and they're not sensitive to that. They're not sensitive to how they have trummeled and disregarded the importance of agency and the individual and accountability, and strewn it into this confection which becomes insoluble. Okay, yeah, so that's, I guess, to someone else completely, but, sorry, a bit of a tangent, I guess, but then I've dealt with two birds with one stone then in this recording. Sorry, so just to tie that all together, the reason why I'm conflating these things, because they are the same theme, they are the same topic, is that if you can try to vilify a problem in a narrative, you can see how by trying to confect that target as the bad guy, you end up essentially destroying the actual medium in which it matters, which is the human psyche in some sense. You end up deriding it, you end up throwing it into a kind of collective psychosis in which the narrative becomes more important than the constituents of the activity in some sense. And it does impoverish the ability of coordination, and essentially does disrespect also the medium, as in the human beings, the people. And I mean, this is a problem. There is a fundamental problem with my framework, with my paradigm. The fundamental problem is that people cannot burden the blame that they deserve to be saddled with. And that is a question perhaps of management. That is almost where perhaps elites came in to mediate that problem. And then you have the problem of elites and the paradox of liberalism in general. Is because in that filtration, in that mediation, you can get layers of subterfuge and layers of a kind of structural, sort of idea of a kind of conspiracy and things like that. And that is almost a kind of insoluble problem in itself, but that is at least an authentic problem that I don't see a way around. Please tell me if there is a way around it, but in some sense I don't see teleportation into utopia. But and in some sense I think that's why people should be, I mean, there's a way of segmenting issues, and there's a way of going deeper and deeper and deeper. But we have to have at least some view as to, essentially, on the deepest level, that we are individually responsible for the whole, even. That essentially the answer to what is the problem with the world is I am. I am the problem. And without being able to make that radical claim, and actually contend it coherently and consistently into one's activities, I think that we somewhat don't deserve to escape the mess that we're in. And we deserve more narrative collective psychosis to some degree. There is no vicarious redemption. This is a very important element to understand. There's no collective redemption as well. Sorry, I went into an aspect of this when I was talking about histrionics as well, and I went sort of into a more esoteric religious sort of rant or whatever, talking about sort of the private scale of heaven or whatever. But the gifts that we give are the same, and the way of privately contending within heaven is the same, and so there's a parity, and we can somewhat have a collective faith, but that is somewhat constructed out of the private faiths, so that we have the same one, but we don't share. We individually burden the collective responsibility, but we don't collectively burden the individual responsibility. Is probably the best way to iron out the kind of nuance that I'm trying to emphasize. That if it doesn't rest on the individual and the complex. See, the problem is that a complex system is fundamentally, in some sense, and its operation, it is fundamentally mysterious. You can't escape that mystery. If you try to sort of obscure that mystery um, into just a single target that then has a kind of narrative grasp, there's this inexorable shift. And so, you're dealing with something that has to, by its very nature, be a kind of dynamism, which in a kind of, in a collective sense, is always going to have a kind of mysterious quality to it. Um, and in as much as that people can have a shared faith, uh, they won't be deluded into investing into a collective blind faith, but they will have a shared faith in that they will all have the same faith. It will be a duplication. Um, this is why I've always sort of treated issues or this concept of what do they call it sometimes? That's why I've often tried to make critiques about it and try to hammer it out is in the most detailed way possible. What do they call it? Distributed intelligence or something like that. Uh, Collective intelligence is a very delicate matter, which hopefully now this has also been a kind of a furthering of the other recordings that I have that deal with collective intelligence and the problems that I see and how that has been spoken about. Maybe this will help to clarify those concerns of mine. Anyway.